This is Origin Stories, the Leakey Foundation podcast. I'm Meredith Johnson. Today we have the final episode in our 3-part miniseries exploring human evolution through the lens of childhood and the fundamental relationships that shape our species and our lives. In this episode, we look at siblings, one of the most important relationships in many people's lives. A relationship that can include everything from love and support to tension, competition, and conflict. Origin Stories contributor Leo Hornack has our story.
But I'm not a big boy now. So now I'm a toddler.
I'm spending Sunday afternoon at a friend's house. And, as usual, all 3 of their kids are competing for attention. And right now, a lot of the competition centres on a new book of amazing global facts.
Americans spend nearly $800 million each year on peanut butter. Peanut butter on jam!
The brothers are 9, 7 and 3. And that means each of them knows they sometimes need to fight to be heard.
Winner.
Our relationships with our siblings can be some of the most profound we have in our lives. After our parents, siblings are often the very first people we live with, and the first people we get to know. Sometimes they become the people we know best. And that's also why living with siblings can be a wonderful, infuriating, and intensely competitive experience.
The worst thing about brothers is they sometimes annoy you. However, the best thing about brothers is they can play with you sometimes and be nice to you.
And of all our family ties, siblinghood is the only relationship that can last from the very earliest years all the way through to old age.
It's good to be the oldest because I can do older things.
But the way we behave with our brothers and sisters might be even more important than that. It could be one of the most significant things that distinguishes us from our closest primate relatives, and one of the things that contributes to our success as a species. In this episode, the pros and cons of siblinghood. Do you like peanut butter?
Yes, I do. I hate peanut butter.
You hate peanut butter, why?
Because I hate it. They gave it to me.
In the Llanos region of Venezuela, near the Colombian border, there's a very special ecosystem. Flat grassland stretching for hundreds and hundreds of miles.
The savannas of South America, they're much like the plains of North America, except there's palm trees and alligators and crocodiles. And there's no large game, unlike the northern plains.
This is Karen Kramer, professor of anthropology at the University of Utah. And she spent a great deal of time in this environment, avoiding the alligators and crocodiles, and studying how other people survive in it. And in particular, how siblings survive and thrive or don't. The community she worked with are the Savannah Pume, who are hunter-gatherers.
So they live in small communities of about 60 individuals. They move about 6 times a year. They rely heavily on fishing.
And this is a community for whom family is very important. So important that in traditional Savannah Pume culture, personal names are not used at all. Instead, each person is identified in speech by their family relationships to the speaker.
They use kin relationships when they speak to each other. So when I arrived, the first thing that happens is everyone comes out of the woods. We all sit down in the middle of the savannah, and we have to figure out how we are related to them.
Fortunately for Karen, her husband happened to be an archaeologist who'd already worked in the area and was considered trustworthy.
And they've already figured out his genealogy. They have to figure out my genealogy, which is not that difficult since I'm married to him.
Her husband was regarded as an honorary brother by one member of the group, a sibling, one of the strongest bonds humans can form.
And so his brother then becomes my brother-in-law, and that is a critical first step because nothing can happen unless you know what your relationship is to the rest of the community. In terms of how food is shared, in terms of where you're going to sling your hammock and sleep, who you're going to share to, that just demonstrates us the fundamentality that kinship plays in these kinds of societies.
Karen's research with the Savannah Pume and other groups around the world has focused on this subject, the power of kinship, and in particular, the role that kinship between siblings plays in human society. And it turns out that being a human sibling brings with it some unusual challenges. Challenges that other great apes rarely face. In the last couple of episodes, we looked at how child rearing in humans has evolved to be a shared project. Mothers receiving essential help and assistance from other adults in their family or community. And that's quite weird by most primate standards. Most other great ape mothers raise their young with little or no help from others. Orangutan mothers are usually solitary, single parents. Chimp mothers are wary of letting any other adults touch their babies at all. And the unusual shared human approach to child rearing has a name: cooperative breeding, a scientific term for the cliché that it takes a village.
Cooperative breeding has allowed us to be an incredibly successful species from a demographic point of view. We are really good at reproducing, and we're really good at surviving.
And one of the special tricks that cooperative breeding makes possible is the human ability to have more kids more often on average than other great apes.
Mammals can't both energetically afford to both lactate and be pregnant, so you do one or the other. So once you've weaned an offspring, then your body can physiologically prepare to sustain pregnancy again. So humans are very unusual in that we have this relatively short period of breastfeeding, about half that of a chimpanzee. That allows mothers to reproduce very quickly. So from a natural selection point of view, it's beneficial for mothers.
It's thought that across human history, the average time between pregnancies for women without access to contraception or birth control would be about 3 to 4 years.
That is about half of what it is in a chimpanzee. So it is in the hominin line, it is in the human line that we go to these very short birth intervals.
That ability to reproduce quickly means that human populations can bounce back quickly and grow rapidly when the conditions are right. But all this has costs. 3 years between births is far shorter than the length of a human childhood.
We then have what are often called overlapping young. Mothers care for multiple dependents of different ages at the same time. So you may have a newborn, a 3-year-old, a 6-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old. They're all competing for mom's attention for different things.
This is another thing that makes our experience of childhood fundamentally different from that of other great apes. Our capacity to have large families with multiple offspring all experiencing childhood at the same time. Our capacity for unusually intense siblinghood. And raising overlapping young is not easy for anyone involved, even with the extra help that comes with cooperative breeding. Humans also have longer childhoods than most mammals, where we gradually mature and learn the skills we need to survive. So the overlap lasts even longer. With each extra mouth to feed, each child experiences greater competition for limited parental attention and resources.
So this then puts mothers in this time allocation problem. She can't take care of the newborn and take care of all of these other children who have different needs and require different kinds of time investments for her to be different places at different times. So there's going to be a certain amount of sibling rivalry in humans that may not exist in other great apes.
As we'll hear, there are situations where overlapping care happens amongst other great apes, including chimpanzees. But because their offspring tend to be spread out more in age, the pressure is less. So the intense sibling rivalry of a large human family, 4, 5 or more kids, all growing up at the same time, might be a distinctively human situation. Put another way, orangutans don't have to fight their older brothers for access to the peanut butter jar. And the pressures of intense sibling rivalry in humans, the dangers of having too many siblings at the same time, can be very real, particularly in societies where food and resources are scarce.
We certainly know if mothers have children at too close of a birth interval, really less than about 3 years, it can be devastating either to the penultimate child that's being weaned or to the newborn.
The World Health Organization also recommends that women space births out by at least 2 years for their own health. So, how have humans managed to survive while producing large families? If each new child gets less attention and a smaller slice of the pie than the last one, is it really just a zero-sum game between you and your brothers and sisters to see who can grab the most time and food from your parents and other carers? Well, Karen has a different explanation. In one of Karen's articles, there's a photo of a young Savannah Pume boy, about 8 years old. He's standing barefoot in the grassland, wearing a blue t-shirt, grey shorts, and a happy smile. It's completely clear he's pleased with himself. And in one hand, he's holding a big bundle of dark grey fish, strung together on a line. The bundle is the size of his head. It's his latest catch from a pond about half a mile away from his home. And he probably won't have been accompanied by an adult when he caught it.
What we find is that a boy can go out fishing for the day and come back with maybe 6 or 7 kilos on average of fish. So that's a lot of calories. That's several thousand calories. So that's enough to feed himself. But the important point is that he's sharing it with the rest of his family.
So already, by this age in the Savannah Pume, this boy is contributing to the family table, not just eating at it, helping to feed his 2 siblings as well.
And likewise, his sister can go out and collect roots. She can bring back on average, more on the order of about 9,000 calories on days that she goes foraging. That's obviously enough to feed herself, but also a large part of her family as well for several days. But that doesn't mean that little girl is only eating roots and that little boy is only eating fish. They're obviously receiving a lot of resources from others in their community as well.
According to Karen, this is one answer to the too many mouths to feed problem. In pre-industrial societies, children can themselves contribute to family resources from a much younger age, making larger families much more viable. But Karen's work has also documented another way in which older siblings contribute to the rest of the family's success. Karen remembers one scene in particular in her visits to the Savannah Pume.
There was a group of kids. They were 3 to 5 years old, and they had spent the day or the morning on the edge of camp, maybe a couple hundred meters away from the rest. So it's a mixed group of boys and girls. They're digging for roots, and they come back and they bring those roots back and they build their own little kid fire, and they roast those roots together, and then they share them with each other.
A carefully organised barbecue for toddlers. Probably not what would be allowed in an American or European kindergarten.
There's no adult telling them what to do. So both boys and girls of different ages are deciding, okay, you do this, you use this tool, you dig over. They're making decisions amongst themselves as a group. You start the fire, let's roast this, and then they have to divide up the roots and share them amongst each other.
So, although unsupervised by adults, the kids were still learning essential skills for life in their culture and feeding themselves a cooked meal. The older brothers and sisters effectively providing childcare for the younger ones, freeing up parents and adults in the community.
One of the kind of most ubiquitous scenes that you see in a traditional society is A 7-year-old girl with her hip extended and her 2 or 3-year-old sibling, she's carrying her 2 or 3-year-old sibling. So kids that are young enough to themselves receive childcare are caring for their younger siblings. So little kids are always in earshot of an adult. If they were to get into trouble and they screamed, there would be someone who would come to their aid. But they are almost always in the company of older siblings.
Most of the literature on cooperative breeding in humans has focused on how mothers get assistance from other adults, from fathers or from grandparents. And there's a great Origin Stories episode on the grandmother hypothesis that explores this. But Karen argues that it's easy to overlook how much older brothers and sisters themselves can help with feeding the family and raising younger siblings, even over the long term, providing the extra support that allows large human families to be viable, and for humans to sustain our unusually long childhoods. And perhaps because so much of our research has been done by people from the industrialised world, where smaller families are the norm, this has all been overlooked. In fact, Karen argues that assuming there is safe spacing between infants, it can in fact be more challenging for a hunter-gatherer mother to manage a small family than a large family.
The probably biggest bind that moms are in is when she's a first-time mother and she has her second child. Because when you have the second, you don't yet have an older sibling to help out.
And of course, that kind of bind, small families with 1 or 2 kids, are typical for most families in the industrialised world.
You don't yet have the 5-year-old. 5-year-olds do take care of 1.5-year-olds. You see that all the time. But you don't yet have that older one to take care. So then you have a newborn and you've got a 2.5-year-old.
The idea of siblings playing a decisive role in each other's childcare and even survival is not unique to humans, though. The bond between chimpanzee siblings can also be extremely important, and in some circumstances, that bond can be the difference between life and death.
Hi Leo, Kat here. A few fieldwork kind of hurdles up here in northern Guinea, but we're getting there.
Kat Hobaiter is a reader in psychology and neuroscience at the University of St Andrews and an expert on the family life of chimpanzees. And she spends around half the year in the field, tracking wild chimp populations in the forests where they live.
A couple of important things to know about chimp social life. So chimpanzees are raised by their mothers. We don't actually know very well whether or not chimp fathers know who their children are. So generally speaking, chimp dads are not very involved in actually raising the children. It's a chimp mum thing. And maternal siblings are, they're siblings in a way that we would easily recognize from human brothers and sisters. They play together, they tease each other, they steal each other's stuff.
As adults, female chimpanzees tend to leave the group they're born into and settle into a new group, so they often get separated from their siblings in later life. But male chimp siblings can form a bond for life.
They'll help potentially support each other, go hunting together, maybe help each other rise through the hierarchy.
But Kat and other researchers have studied one particular situation where that sibling bond can change into something even more powerful and fundamental. A situation where something has gone tragically wrong.
So chimpanzees can survive without their mother from the age of 3 or 4 years old, but it's incredibly difficult for them.
Primatologists call this being orphaned because when a young chimp loses his or her mother, they lose the only active parent in their lives. But there are circumstances where a young orphan chimp does have a shot at survival, if another member of the community steps up, often an older brother or sister.
The kind of things that we see happening are your older brother or sister will travel with you, they'll wait for you to catch up, so they're not going to leave you alone, they would share food with you, they'd groom you more often, they would support you if there was a fight, they would potentially nest next to you or close to you at night. All the kind of things that we see mums doing for their kids. The older brothers or sisters take on those roles.
And that can demand a huge change in behaviour from the older sibling.
And what we see is that they become tiny little grown-ups very quickly. Suddenly they take on a lot more of the kind of adult roles, that sort of parental role.
And this unusual behaviour has now been measured in the field.
Being with a chimpanzee sometimes feels, it's like a pretty euphoric experience. I would say in many ways it feels like being with another person.
Rachna Reddy is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Utah, a colleague of Karen Kramer. Rachna's also a Leakey Foundation grantee, and she spent years studying daily chimp life in the forest.
They're so similar to humans that we have a special window into the way they're interacting with things. If they suddenly splash in the water and get cold, or they're suddenly frightened and they hold someone's hand, those are immediate reactions that we can empathize with or understand how they were feeling. All of these things mean that when you're walking behind them in the forest, you're kind of plugged in to their world, and it's a bit like you're seeing things through their eyes. It reminds me most of being with a really young child.
In 2019, Rachna was watching the younger members of a large chimp community in Kibale National Park in Uganda, spending hours and days following the troop through the forest. And around that time, a catastrophe struck the group, a common cold-like virus that swept through the wild chimp population, killing many of them.
This terrible event happened. 4 of my subjects, of 30 subjects, lost their mother. And this is something that losing your mother as a chimpanzee anytime before age 16 will negatively affect your survival.
So not only the lives of those who caught the virus were under threat, but their offspring as well.
3 of these males were under the age of 12, still ages where they really needed their mothers. All of them had younger siblings, and all of them adopted their younger siblings.
And because she was on the scene already, Rachna could watch the chimp sibling adoption process unfold.
What my study showed is what happens to you in this crisis, how you transition when your mother dies to being a parent to your sibling and take on this new role for them. And it showed they were really doing behaviors that are responsible, like not just affectionate, they're really being responsible.
And she was able to analyse how this happened.
So I would say that something like playing with an infant or grooming them is an affectionate behavior. But something like comforting them when they're distressed, every time you're traveling, checking that they're coming, getting distressed when you can't find them, watching them while they play, and if somebody is being too rough, indicating that you're watching or actually being aggressive to that individual, I think those are caretaking behaviors.
There was one incident that Rachna recorded a few years earlier that summed up the new role of an adoptive older sibling. Damien was a 9-year-old chimp, so still not an adult. But his sister Etta was even younger, just 4 years old, far below the age where a chimp can survive alone. And around this time, Damien and Etta's mother disappeared. Rachna watched as Damien and Etta's relationship changed. Etta began following Damien and another older brother all the time, until one time they were travelling together and Etta became separated from Damien. And Rachna saw Damien's reaction.
But Etta had gone farther ahead, and he started to stand up and look forward and stand up and look forward and really scratch himself and scratch his legs, scratch his arms, and he was standing on 2 legs and looking and whimpering a little bit. And so I thought he was waiting. This is a form of, a pretty extreme form of travel vigilance.
Because travelling through the forest apart from the rest of the group can be very dangerous, particularly on the edge of the group's territory, where rival chimp groups might attack.
So Damien was doing this, but in a very exaggerated way, and he was looking back to where Etta had gone, and scratching, whimpering, opening his mouth a little bit, which is sort of a distressed expression. And then Etta suddenly came back toward him, but as she came, she was whimpering and sort of looking around, and she saw him and went as she kept coming closer, and then when she got really close, she just ran sort of into his arms and went, ah! And then he embraced her really tightly. And then they both ran together in the direction of their brother Rollins. And then they were sort of glued to their older brother, this adult who knows where to find food and everything. They were glued to him for the next few weeks.
Eventually, it turned out that Damien and Etta's mother was still alive, and she returned to the group sometime after. As part of their study, Rachna and her co-author John Mitani analysed 4 types of chimp behaviour. Proximity, how much time orphan and adopter spent together. Reassurance, how often they acted to console each other. vigilance, how much they monitored each other's position for safety, and grooming behaviour, which is a crucial ritual for chimp bonding. All of these behaviours increased during adoption. And this study and others like it, including work by Kat Hobaiter, has confirmed the benefits of chimp adoption behaviour. It works, or at least it helps.
So being adopted by an adult, whether they're your sibling or not, but being adopted by an adult increases the likelihood that you survive, at least in the immediate years after being adopted. And then to look at whether it increases lifelong survival takes a long time because chimps live about as long as humans.
So at least in this circumstance, the idea of older brothers and sisters taking on a crucial caregiving role for siblings, and even saving their lives, is something that applies beyond our own species.
I was just going to ask, that do you find yourself seeing, human interactions differently because of your studies?
It's hard to... I think about it more. It's really hard for me to parse apart. They're so intertwined. I think that it's interesting, like watching my friends' children with their younger siblings, just the way that they'll touch or the way that they'll seek attention from their mother, even when the younger sibling is born, is really, it's all so similar. But then sometimes I don't want to, I don't always want to be like, yes, your children are just like chimps.
Karen's work with the Savannah Pume and other communities across the world has helped her make her central argument that sibling competition in large families is balanced by sibling assistance, and that our success as a species couldn't have happened without us raising large families where the older siblings help to feed and care for the younger.
And I think it's fairly well accepted. I think it's irrefutable what the data is telling us, that children are helping children. Where the argument is in the evolutionary story. And the dad people want to be first in terms of, it's male parental care that's explaining human evolution. The grandmother people want to be in terms of it's grandmothers that explain human evolution. And this is a third idea, which I think actually involves fewer complexities in terms of explaining how we get those short birth intervals, those multiple dependents of different ages at the same time.
The idea of cooperation being essential to the success of human families and the human species is an idea that's come up again and again in this mini-series. A common thread in our episodes on motherhood and fatherhood as well. Put simply, we as primates are built to help each other, and that we all need that help too to survive. The work of raising the next generation is only possible when we recognise the need for that help. And that's true when it comes to raising tiny, helpless babies, noisy toddlers, raucous 10-year-olds, or inquisitive teenagers. And kids themselves also show an appetite for teamwork, cooperation, and interaction from a very early age.
Do you ever help your brothers?
Sometimes.
Mummy taught a beekeeper him in teapot to make a cup of tea.
Back at my friend's house, there are plenty of moments where you can see the skills of sibling cooperation being worked on, although most often in the form of sharing some amazing global facts.
The world's largest peanut butter and jam sandwich weighed about as much as a polar bear.
Wow! Imagine a polar bear made of peanut butter.
That would be delicious.
It will be a lot less dangerous than an ordinary polar bear.
That's a wrap for our mini-series looking at families and childhood from an evolutionary perspective. What stands out for me in these stories is how flexible humans are in these roles and how we can all take part in the work of raising children. Thanks to Karen Kramer, Kat Hobaiter, and Rachna Reddy for sharing their work. And thanks to the three brothers at Tabley Road. Origin Stories is a listener-supported project of the Leakey Foundation. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly or one-time donation to help us make more episodes. For a limited time, your tax-deductible donation will be matched. Click the link in the show notes to give right now. We really appreciate it. This mini-series was generously sponsored by father and daughter Bill Richards and Dana LaJoie, and I thank them from the bottom of my heart, with additional support from the Ann and Gordon Getty Foundation, Jeanne Newman, the Joan and Arnold Travis Education Fund, and listeners like you. This episode was produced by Leo Hornack, sound design by Ray Pang, our editor is Audrey Quinn, theme music by Henry Nagel, additional music by Blue Dot Sessions and Lee Rosevere. Thanks for listening.